Good afternoon, everybody. Just giving a minute to let everybody join as we're getting started. I have about a minute out to 3, so just letting folks come in. All right. Wait until it says 3 o'clock before we get formally started, but welcome to the Ent webinar on breaking paycheck to paycheck cycle. I am Sarah Bickers. I work at Ent Credit Union in our community education department. So we have a team of folks dedicated to helping the financial wellness of our communities, and this webinar series is part of that offering. We offer many webinars, including this one on different financial wellness topics. A little bit about me while we're waiting before we get started is I am a former high school English teacher, so my background is teaching high school English, and I joined Ent's financial education team about 3 years ago, and I go out into the communities and teach financial wellness classes, kind of like this one. This is a short webinar that we offer as part of this series. Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and dive into it. We're going to talk about breaking that paycheck to paycheck cycle, why we're all here today. The first thing I want to share with you all is some key takeaways from this presentation. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about evaluating our habits and values, looking at that as part of breaking the cycle. We're going to talk about creating spending plans. Some people might know that as a budget. And we're going to talk about reducing debt and building savings as part of the strategy to go about this. As I go through this presentation, if you do have questions, you should be able to ask questions in the chat feature for me to see at the end of it. And if anybody does have questions, I'll make sure to try to reach out and answer them as best as possible. The first thing that we want to do is really define what we mean by living paycheck to paycheck. We have a few different quotes here on definitions of paycheck to paycheck, what other people might say about it. Some people might say it's spending all of the money from one paycheck before receiving the next paycheck, or to spend all of your income on those monthly living expenses, or an informal expression describing one's inability to pay for living expenses if they lost their income. All of these quotes are reflections of what it might be like to live paycheck to paycheck. With paycheck to paycheck, you're living month to month. You have those expenses covered, maybe making it by a little bit. If anything happens, it can be a big struggle to cover some of those expenses. Savings, especially for long-term goals and those unexpected things, might not be happening. And it can be a really stressful place to be in because any one thing can throw off the balance of your financial health. And so working to find long-term financial security, working out of paycheck to paycheck or breaking the cycle can be a great financial goal to have. With that, one thing I want to share is that a lot of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. This isn't something that a lot of us are alone in if we are living paycheck to paycheck. 67% of Americans, according to the study by Payments Intelligence, live paycheck to paycheck. And of that, it's folks that even are making over $100,000. 48% who make over $100,000 live paycheck to paycheck. So it's folks of all income levels, lots of different demographics in that paycheck to paycheck cycle for a lot of different reasons. With that, 27% have no emergency savings. So if something were to happen, something even small that's an emergency, they don't have savings to cover it, and it can be a really, really stressful event. And there are a lot of reasons why one might find themselves in the paycheck to paycheck cycle. Maybe their income might not be sufficient to cover different expenses. We'll talk about that as well and different ways to address income. Maybe they aren't really sure what their budget needs to look like, and maybe we need to create a budget to figure out how we work out of it. All of these things are things we'll talk about through breaking that paycheck to paycheck cycle. So as we go through it, think about where you might be at, what this looks like for you, and what some of those different goals you might have to work toward would be. With that, the first step to working out of the paycheck to paycheck cycle is to kind of capture where you're at now, figure out what some of that stuff is. So this cycle that we're in is where we're spending in month to month, we're getting paid, we're having that income come in, and then we're paying those bills that are due. So we're paying what we have covering some things, and then kind of scrambling with whatever is left over, figuring out how are we going to cover these different things. In some situations with paycheck to paycheck, we might have to borrow to cover some unexpected expenses, some things that come up throughout the way. But there's not that consistency in that amount that's due for bills. We're not really sure what's going on there. And that next paycheck that we have is already used up. So there's already those expenses that are coming up in the future that we have plans for, like as soon as we get that money in, we know where it's going because that bill has already been planned for. And it can be really hard to save here. We might rely on some credit cards to cover things, which can lead to some really stressful debt that we'll talk about later. So this cycle is known as the earn, spend, or the paycheck to paycheck cycle, and maybe some borrowing might be involved. And so the goal is to work out of this cycle. So as I mentioned, that first step there is to figure out what things are really looking like, get a holistic picture of your spending and your spending patterns. So one way to do that is to track your expenses. I do recommend doing this as much as possible in a way that is very hands-on. So you're interacting with your statement items, you're seeing what you're spending money on, you're really kind of getting that picture. It can be a little time consuming to do it this way. So figure out how much time you have to dedicate to this. Do something that is manageable to you. The goal is really here to ask yourself the question, what is my spending? What am I spending money on? And so with this, ideally, if you were able to pull at least 3 months of your bank statements, 3 months of your expenses, and to go through those line items and categorize them, say, maybe here's what I'm spending on gas. Here's what I'm spending on food. Figure out some of those different categories. 3 months is a really good picture because anything can happen in a given month, and 3 months for a lot of people tends to give a holistic picture of what those spending trends and patterns and habits might be. For some people, especially folks that might have variable income, you might want to go back even further to get 6 months, a whole year, kind of get those patterns that you might be dealing with. But if that seems overwhelming, start with just 1 month of a statement. Take a look at the past month and say, what are those categories? How much am I spending in them? What's my income? What's that picture that I'm dealing with here? So that way that you get that holistic picture. And then start to identify trends, patterns, habits. We'll revisit those things as we go through this because all of those patterns are going to be informative for how we might want to move forward from here. Once you have tracked your expenses and have a picture of what spending has been on, what pattern you're falling into, the next step is to really think about what your goals are. Goals can be pretty broad and are definitely really personal things when we're talking about financial goals. But I want to share a few kind of general goals to think about regarding our finances that a lot of different financial experts recommend we kind of work toward, especially some of these long-term goals and some steps that we can take to reach some of these goals. So if we're getting started working out of paycheck to paycheck and thinking about some goals that we might want to identify, maybe one goal is to have that monthly budget. Maybe another goal is to build up a $500 emergency fund. When we talk about emergency funds, 500 is an example. Maybe it's less, maybe eventually it's more, but getting started, whatever that manageable goal is for you, is one to keep in mind. And then if we are dealing with credit cards and credit card debt, maybe one goal is to pay off one credit card, starting with that as a goal to keep in mind. So these are just options. With this, it's really what goals are personal to you. If we're thinking about building up from there, going into that strengthen category, maybe the next step might be to save 3 months worth of expenses. Maybe we start to invest for retirement. Maybe we look at paying down some high interest rate debt. Really, it's just kind of what these look like to you, just some ideas here. And then as we look toward bigger goals, other things to think about, working up toward that recommended 6-month emergency fund. Financial experts do recommend that 6-month emergency fund, but when you're just getting started, that can be a really intimidating goal to have. And then investing and saving for long-term goals and maximizing retirement contributions. So different goals to think about. Again, with this, the important one is to figure out maybe within the next year, what is a really manageable goal for you, what are those really important things that you're working toward. So then you can take your spending that you tracked and think about those goals and think how you're going to work toward reaching them through what we like to call a spending plan, but a lot of people might refer to it as a budget. With this, there are a lot of different budgeting strategies out there that you all can use. There is no one size fits all budget. There are a lot of templates that you might like. There are a lot of apps that you might like. There are a lot of different ways to go about it. Just like with the values, this is a very personal thing, but some big picture things to keep in mind might be focusing again on what matters most. So, a values based budget. What are those things that you really care about that you want to put your spending toward? With a values based budget, you're asking yourself every time you go to make a purchase, is this something I care about? Is this a value of mine? Is it helping me work toward my goals, and aligning all your spending with that goal setting that you're working toward and creating categories based on what you really care about. Another budgeting strategy you might want to use as you're thinking about this big picture is what's known as the percentile budgeting method or the 50-30-20 budgeting method. With this budgeting strategy, you break down your take home pay, so your after tax, after other deduction income, into three categories: your needs, your wants, and your savings. And with the rule of thumb, the suggestion, the guideline, these percentages are flexible, but as a kind of like a framework to think about it, they recommend putting 50% of that take home pay towards needs. So typically for a lot of people, things like housing, groceries, utilities, etc. 30% towards wants, so dining out, hobbies, travel, whatever those wants are to you, and then 20% towards savings. So things like your emergency fund, retirement, debt payoff, etc., that big broad savings category. Again, with those percentages are suggestions, things to think about. For a lot of Americans, we end up spending more than 50% on our needs because that's the reality of things. And when we're just getting started out, moving out of that paycheck to paycheck cycle, especially, this might have looked very different for us in the past. So, as we'll talk about, one of the things that we're going to want to focus on to move out of the paycheck to paycheck cycle is that savings category, especially. So, how can we start to really prioritize savings, put that first in our budget, find long term financial security, reach those long term goals to us? With that, there are a few things to keep in mind regarding what we might be saving for, how we might be saving, and some strategies to use. One is that we save for a lot of different reasons. And so one of those reasons might be to weather financial emergencies. This type of savings is known as our emergency fund or our safety net savings. And so this savings helps cover us in those unexpected events. So with safety net savings, when you're working toward identifying like what is how you're going to start it if you don't have it already, when you go back through those expenses and you say, wait, that thing wasn't that important to me, that's not a value I have, that's not something I care about, maybe those are areas in our budget in your budget you can start putting toward things like your emergency fund or different savings goals that you might have. So finding those places to get started, however small this might be it $2, a dollar, whatever that is, or even more to build up your emergency fund. Uh, as long as you're building that habit, that's really key here. So finding that space in your budget, starting it as a priority, saying, okay, this is going to go toward that goal that I have of financial security. Then easy access, just making sure you have access to your safety net savings is another thing to keep in mind. What we mean by that is if these emergencies arise, you want to make sure you're able to access those funds easily and you know what they are. So we typically recommend a high yield savings account, something that is liquid, something that doesn't fluctuate a lot, that doesn't involve a lot of risk. So something where you're making some interest on it ideally, but you know you're able to access those funds reliably if that emergency arises. Calculating your goals. I already shared a few goals for regarding different emergency funds in that setting goals slide a few slides ago. Those experts recommend having 3 to 6 months of expenses and an emergency fund when we're just getting started and moving out of paycheck to paycheck, especially figuring out what if that goal is $500, if it's 100, if it's just getting started building that habit. That can be really, really relative here. So finding a goal, maybe again within a year that works for you. And then knowing what you would spend that emergency fund money on is another part of this. So thinking about those safety net savings as part of your savings goals. So that way, when you're evaluating your budget and working out of paycheck to paycheck, you're building the habit of paying yourself first for that long term financial security, for being able to weather some of those storms that in paycheck to paycheck we might not have been able to weather in the past. Another type of savings I want to touch on before moving on here is what's known as periodic savings. Periodic savings is meant for those expenses that don't come up every month. And those can be really ones that get a lot of people stuck in that paycheck to paycheck cycle because you're planning for those things. And then there's something where you like kind of know it's coming up, but it's like replacing your tires or an annual bill. You're like, oh, this is like totally disrupting things. So, starting to include those periodic expenses in your monthly budget can make a huge difference in kind of being having some surprise to those expenses when they come along, even though we know they're happening. So, just starting to set fragments of those aside and save for those as well as part of the big budgeting or spending plan picture can really help move from what would have been paycheck to paycheck to we're prioritizing savings, we're anticipating those things that are coming up, we're including those things as part of the budget. So with this, what kind of what we've shared so far is going over those expenses, knowing what's happening, and starting to set a budget that anticipates future expenses, that includes saving for emergency funds, that includes saving for long-term goals. But a lot of you might be asking the question, okay, that sounds great and all, but what if I'm in that really real situation that a lot of people are in where I'm not able like to cover those expenses that are coming up. I can't save right now. And so that's what's referred to as a cash flow issue. So, cash flow, simply put, is that money coming in and out of our account. So, it's our income minus our expenses. And a lot of the times when we're living paycheck to paycheck, these numbers are really close. We're making just about what we're spending, again, for a lot of different reasons. And so, evaluating values, evaluating priorities, looking at spending habits can be a big chunk of it. Also, looking at increasing income. So, really, there are only two ways to improve cash flow. We either spend less or we make more. Typically speaking, the recommendation if we need to improve cash flow is to try to decrease expenses first. Obviously, that's not doable for everybody who's like really in those tight situations. So that's why increase income is on here. But increasing income can be harder to do. So if we're able to decrease expenses and really evaluate those things, that tends to be the first step recommendation. So when you're looking to decrease expenses, these are your budget busters. These are the things that have been breaking your budget, that have been really, really challenging your financial health. And a lot of them might come down to our spending habits, which are things that we're able to identify when we do that expense tracking, when we look at that those patterns of spending that we've been falling into. So anything that is not a value, anything that is not a goal, anything that is not important to you is a budget buster that's not helping you reach those goals that you might be trying to identify here. So evaluating those spending habits and really looking at those patterns of spending to start spending towards those goals and those things that are important to you can help eliminate those budget busters and decrease expenses. Another thing to consider is impulse buying. There are a lot of different types of impulse buying that you can fall into from like, I see it, I saw it, I got it, to like, there's marketing influence to you were planning on buying anything and now you have to fill up your Amazon cart to like reach the minimum or whatever it might be. And so just watching out for some triggers that you might have for different kinds of impulse buying as well as retail therapy and maybe try to cut those things that get you to impulse buy or buy things to uh, kind of treat whatever might be going on can be helpful. Another type of budget buster to consider is unnecessary fees. So when you're looking at your accounts, when you're looking at your subscriptions, when you're looking at different things that you might be paying for, seeing if there are any alternatives to avoid paying certain fees that you might not have to be paying. So that way that's more money in your pocket. You're cutting out that expense from your budget and you're increasing your cash flow that way. The other side of improving cash flow is really thinking about the big picture, looking at long-term goals, evaluating your budget, and kind of like really thinking, what are those priorities here? What am I working toward long term? What might a lot of these things look like? And then another component of this might be to increase that income. So maybe it's short term selling something, figuring out what resources are available to you. If you're looking for resources and don't really know where to start, we always recommend United Way 211 is a great place to go to kind of find out what help might be out there. Another increased income sort of thing that you might want to consider is maybe looking at a second job or side hustle. When I talk about budgeting, I like to share that this is something that is intimately integrated into our entire life. And we're looking at holistic health here, not just our financial health. And so, for a lot of people, maybe we're already working that second job, or maybe we really just don't have capacity for it. So, if that's something that you're able to do to increase your income, amazing. Uh, Explore that, keep that in mind, but just remember that we're trying to balance a lot of things here. So, that's not an option for everybody. And then kind of negotiating what position you might be in already, looking for raises, looking to see what long-term career growth might be to improve that cash flow. Long-term or even temporarily might be something else to consider as far as looking at different ways to improve cash flow. So, with all of that, cash flow can be a really important part of living paycheck to paycheck. So, if you're looking at needing to increase your cash flow or improve your cash flow, keep a lot of these different things in mind and find that balance that works best for you, depending on what resonated the most. But another component of living paycheck to paycheck and figuring out what our spending plans might look like is debt. And so, if debt is part of your financial picture at the moment, there are a few things to keep in mind to kind of make sure you're capturing all the information you need to capture and coming up with a plan that's going to work best overall. And so, step one when you're dealing with debt is to get that information organized. And so it's making a list of your credit cards, student loans, medical bills, home and auto loans, and gathering details such as the balance, the interest rate, the payment, and the term for all debt that you might be dealing with. So then you can, as a part of that overall spending plan, come up with a debt repayment strategy that's going to work best for your overall financial goals. So there are a lot of different debt repayment strategies to consider. With this, picking the one that's going to help you reach the goals the most and that you're going to stick to and that balances everything is really key. But I do want to go through some of those options. So the first one that we have up here is what's known as the snowball debt repayment method. So with this debt repayment method, you're going to ideally make those minimum balances for all the debts that you have. And then you're going to, are those minimum payments. And then you're going to order them from smallest balance to largest balance. Find room in that budget that you're going to put toward debt repayment as that goal that you have, and say, I'm working toward paying off my smallest balance debt first. So that way you're able to pay it off, cross it off the list, say, awesome, I did it, good job, and roll up what you were putting toward the minimum and then toward that smallest balance into the next smallest balance and work toward paying that off. So that way you're paying them down from smallest to largest balance. You're getting that motivation boost by crossing them off the list, and you're seeing that progress along the way to work toward paying down that debt, which in turn frees up money long term to go towards some other goals that you might have, such as some of those savings goals that we talked about, because paying down that debt can really do that for us within our budgets. It can be a great goal to have. The next debt repayment strategy up here is what's known as the avalanche method. With this, you make those minimum payments, find that room in the budget to put towards those debt repayment goals, and say, I really want to work toward paying that highest interest rate debt off first. So you pay off highest interest rate debt. It might take a little longer, depending on what that debt is, to cross it off the list, pay it off, and then again, you roll that up into next highest interest rate debt. So you're paying it from highest interest rate to lowest interest rate. Again, freeing up money for the future to put towards other goals that you have and reaching that goal of paying down debt. Avalanche has the benefit of saving you money overall because you are paying down those high interest rate debts. But a lot of people might prefer the snowball method because they have that motivation as they see things pay off and lessen the number of debts they're managing. So really, when you're picking between those two to figure out what strategy you're going to work best, go with the one you're most likely to stick with. So just pick the one that appeals to you the most. The other two things on here are for when you're in situations where maybe it's a lot to keep track of or something's going on. So with consolidation, what you're doing is you're looking to consolidate. So to take several different debts that you have and loop them into one new loan based on your credit score, your history with those other debts. And a lot of the times people might look to consolidate a lot of times to save money on an interest rate and to not have so many things to keep track of. So if you're in a situation where you can get a good consolidation loan and it'll help you save money and help you have less to keep track of, that's a lot of the reason why people explore consolidation as an option with debt repayment. And then refinancing is to reevaluate those terms of the loan. So it's like a new loan rather than multiple, just for the one to say, okay, maybe my credit score is better, the interest rates are better, and so I can get a better situation to reevaluate those loan term statuses in that situation to save me money on those interest rates and on that term over time. So it helps with freeing up some money in the moment. And then with that, you just want to make sure that you're looking at the whole financial picture, because sometimes this can mean dragging out a loan term a little bit, and you just want to look at how it fits into that overall financial picture. So these are a few different debt repayment strategies to keep in mind. All of these are when you're in situations where you feel confident managing your debt on your own. So if you are in a situation where you are overwhelmed by debt and trying to get some support with that, there are a lot of resources out there. I'll talk at the end about Ent's financial coaches, which are free, that can help guide you if that's something that you're exploring. And then just know that there's a big difference between debt management and debt settlement programs. So look into the differences and the impacts of both of them if that's something that you're exploring, is like trying to manage your debt. So with all of that, after we think about the expenses that we're in and we figure out what all these savings goals are that we have and figure out what those monthly categories we have and figure out that overall spending plan that we're working toward. The goal is to work toward this new spending cycle that is breaking that paycheck to paycheck cycle that we might have been following into. So that paycheck to paycheck cycle that I mentioned is what's known as earn, spend, earn, spend. So you're making money, you're spending money, you're making money, you're spending money. Savings isn't really happening, and maybe borrowing might be involved. With this new spending cycle, after implementing and thinking about all the things we talked about, you would be in the cycle that's known as earn, save, spend. So the idea here is that real concept that I talked a lot about of paying yourself first and prioritizing those savings goals through ways of like, what are those savings goals? How much can I put toward it? Freeing up some other expenses and maybe increasing income as necessary. And so once you've identified those savings goals and figured out what you can put towards savings, one key thing here that I really recommend for everybody is to automate those transfers to savings, because humans, we can forget about it. We can just there's a lot going on in our lives. And so having that automation piece happening, saying we're going to just send money to savings, it happens anyway, we don't have to think about it, can be really helpful to stick to those goals that we have. The next part of this is to pay bills through a dedicated bills account. Note with cushion. So we want some cushion, ideally, with those bills to make sure that we're paying them, it's working. And then each month we replenish the bills account with the same amount for what we know is coming up and what some of those periodic savings expenses, some of those things that don't happen every month, but we know they're happening. So replenishing that, making sure we have that space in our budget, and reevaluating that spending plan regularly, because all this stuff can change a lot. So as much as we can check in on our budget and our goals can really help us reach those financial goals that we have long term. So with this new spending cycle, the goal is to try to get ahead a bit, automate those finances to make sure all these things are happening automatically so that we know we're happening and we can't forget about them. We're maximizing our cash flow, and we're really prioritizing our goals. With this, it's important to stay motivated. So manageable milestones, track your progress, focus on those values, and find community to provide accountability. For me, it's my husband and the people I work with at Ent who help hold me accountable toward my goals. And then celebrate those wins. Have some sort of celebration where you reward your progress, have meaningful rewards, something that means a lot to you, and then keep it budget friendly. Don't forget that as well, and really reflect on your success. With that, we're right about at 3:30. And so if you're looking for more resources, we have some other webinars. We also have free financial coaching. You don't need to be a member of Ent to use this service. That QR code should take you to our coaching page where you can schedule an appointment or just check out what it does to help come up with that spending planner, budget, or if you want to talk about credit, savings, debt repayment, any of those other things that you might be working on as well. Our coaches can help, and they're really amazing. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have if you're able to ask me in the chat. Otherwise, you can find me at sbickers@ent.com or ent.com for the email. And it was lovely to have you all in the presentation today. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. See you at our next webinar. All right, I see somebody raise their hand, so I'm gonna allow to talk. Do you have a question? I see you unmuted, but I don't know if it.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yeah.
Awesome. Is this something that we can go back in and listen to again, like in 30 minutes, 20 minutes?
Yeah, so the presentation was recorded. It takes a little bit for our team to get it uploaded to our YouTube page, but it will be there to view eventually. It won't be that immediate though.
Okay, like a couple days?
I don't know exactly the timeline, but
Okay.
if you share your email, I can make sure to send it to you once it's available.
Okay. And do we have other videos like this on YouTube?
Yeah, absolutely. I can send you the YouTube page that has our other recordings.
Okay. This one was really good. Thank you very much.
I'm so glad. You're welcome. Are you able to send a chat with your email, a private one to me?
If I'm able to do what?
To send your email in a chat so I can make sure to get you that information.
Where do I send it?
Are you able to see something that says chat or a Q&A?
Yes,
And
yes.
you can
Okay.
type it in one of those. I can make sure to get it to you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. I'm so glad. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. I see somebody in the Q&A asked advice on finding a side hustle. There are a lot of different side hustle options out there. I know that depending on what kind of side hustle that you might be. Maybe some like social media community might be a good place to check. Um, I know that there's like, I think it's called Task Rabbit. Is that right? There are like odd job forums where you can look to see like what sort of gig work might be available. Um, so kind of just thinking like
Just similar.
what skills do you have and what are you into to be able to find a side hustle that works within like your lifestyle, your interest, and really leans into that big picture thing that I was talking about. Yeah, awesome. All right. Somebody else asked about an expense tracking tool that you love. I see you currently use Excel. So I'm personally an Excel junkie myself. So I budget, it's in Google Sheets, but it's essentially Excel. And Google Sheets has a template that I used. It was just like annual budget tracker that has the whole year, and I edited it for myself. So that's what I use because I really like it. I know some people really like certain apps that are available. I don't have any off the top of my head that because I don't use those to share with you. And then there are some templates and things like Canva as well that people have said they really like. And then I have other friends who expense track on paper just because they like it. And studies have shown that if you write things on paper, you're more likely to remember it and really engage with it. So there is some power to that. So, like an expense tracking journal, I think you can look that up and find it online and buy it at a platform that works for you. So, a lot of different tools like that. I know Excel has its downsides, but for those who kind of like that format, that's one thing to keep in mind. But if you're looking for something that's a little like less tedious to manage, some of those budgeting apps might be a good thing to explore. All righty. I think I answered all the questions we have so far. Thank you everybody so much. Um, I'm going to type in my email. Hopefully everybody can see that in the chat form. So that way, if you have any follow-up questions or you would like to receive that recording and those other recordings that I mentioned, I can send it to you all. So please send me an email at aspectors@ent.com if you would like any of those resources. But unless anybody else has any questions, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I'm going to go ahead and end the Zoom webinar. Mary, I see your question right before I close. So the money tracker that I use in Google can be edited. There's like some limits to the things that you can edit just because if you edit too much, it'll like ruin the formula that it uses. But I was able to edit a lot of sections in a way that works for me. Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.